I want to take this time to discuss a concept that I've been wrestling with recently in the wake of discussions about white supremacy and the post-racial society and globalism. Among some victims of colonization, victims of white supremacy, African people, which some people call black or melanites or what have you. For this discussion, I'll use the term African, and intermittently I'll probably throw in a black term here and there, or possibly even the term melanite. But as far as African people, there's been a lot of confusion surrounding this concept of the good white person. When discussing racism in the 21st century, and we all know racism is white supremacy. It's the only functional form of racism because among the leading institutions of the world, military, financial, media, etc., governmental, diplomatic, those are largely operated by Europeans. Europeans or white people, nominally white people. So I'll refer to Europeans as either European or nominally white. So those are pretty much the people who are in charge, and so these are the institutions of white supremacy. But they've set up a contradiction in their social engineering project as Europeans face falling birth rates, weakening economies in their traditional spheres of influence. Lots of African people who were until pretty much the late 80s sequestered in neighborhoods and communities of their own, except for a few people in the so-called black middle class who were picked off by attaining high levels of education or marketable skills that were able to be utilized in European-run institutions and corporations. Until the mid-90s, early 80s, or excuse me, until the late 80s, most of the Africans were sequestered in communities or neighborhoods. Regarding the Western world, Western equals white or European, so I want to clarify that. When people use the term Western society or Western nations, Western world, they're talking about Europeans, European culture. And of course the continent had its own reality, but they were under international subjugation by these same institutions. So with all that said, that kind of foundation laying, I'd like to go into a problem that I've seen popping up here and there in discussions of white supremacy, and that is the notion of the good white person. Most Africans will try to diffuse any charges of persisting white supremacy or racism by using the argument that there are good white people, and therefore white supremacy or racism has either ended or diminished. Furthermore, they'll add this observation that there are several bad African people or bad black people, and therefore because there are some good people who are nominally white and some good African people and some bad white supremacist Europeans and some bad Africans, that means racism really has no force in the present society, and that we should focus on other avenues. The problem with this argument when it's espoused by African people is that we don't have a criteria for assessing the notion of the good white person. To really get into this deeply, we have to understand that what's called the Western world is actually European culture. European culture has permeated throughout the European nations which are offshoots primarily from the western portion of the European continent. And the imperial project that was carried out in these areas, speaking of Canada, New Zealand, the United States, and Azania, also known as South Africa, Australia, Tasmania, and several nations in the Central and South American continent, is largely complete. The European framework of cultural activity and behaviors pretty much been established, and during the 1960s social upheaval, social revolution, or political revolutionary activities, the counter-revolutionary tactics employed by many of these white institutional governments and corporations and think tanks was largely successful in creating the African middle class, the black middle class, assassinating, leadership, and imprisoning other leadership or forcing others into exile. With regard to other colonial nations that had sought their independence and self-determination status during the 60s and 70s, there was a large international counter-revolution against that in the form of the IMF, the World Bank, NATO, other entities, including the canard we know as the Cold War. In the context of that, we in Western nations, and of course I'll reiterate, Western means European, means white, we have been already inculcated with what I call the European culture. Our culture as African people and other colonized people has essentially been stripped a whole cloth from our psyche and been replaced by what is essentially a functional psychosis. So with this context, I'd like to challenge the notion of using that moral equivalency argument to say that, well, there are some good white people and there are some bad white people and there are some good African people or some bad African people or black people. Because within this framework, most of the African people or colonized people are operating with a functional psychosis and a colonized mind. So to assess their behavior on a moralistic scale within the context of adopting a foreign culture is actually misplaced. Assessing activity of the cultural dominators, the Europeans, within their own cultural framework that has been imposed is actually more accurate. Therefore, to actually determine whether a person is a good white person or a bad white person, new criteria must be developed by the colonized, by the Africans, to determine through their own experience what constitutes this conceptual good white person. And it must relate to pressing needs, either immediate or long-term needs of the African people themselves. Europeans are complicit or active or participants in something I call that actually is a formulation from Mwalimu K. Baruti. They are participants in the European cultural conspiracy. What the European cultural conspiracy does is to essentially make every European person an agent to carry out and apply European domination over the world. How this is done is by several means. The most recent mean is this concept of globalization. Globalization is the attempt to actually internationalize this European culture and force each and every sovereign nation to adopt these mores, values, and activities in all areas of human life, producing and sustaining activity. One of the ways this is done is through the media, obviously. When we have the media propagating images which glorify Europeans, accentuate European standards of beauty and activities and humor, and denigrate other groups to either an absolutely reprehensible image or buffoonery image, or an image which aspires to participate in European culture. Okay? Furthermore, we see several archetypes which have been hashed out before by many people much more well educated on this point than I, but the white savior archetype, or the action hero archetype being the white male, the romantic comedy film which presents the white male, white female interaction as the ideal and the standard for romantic and intimate relationships. I'll even go one further. Even in the pornography, we can see the promotion of white sexual activities, sexual tastes, sexual perversions above all else, and a kind of subtle manipulation of the psychology of people who consume pornography in order to get them to adopt the same sexual behaviors and perversions and abandon their own cultural activities and cultural rituals and sexual behaviors. So with that said, I'm just trying to create a mental picture for you to see how pervasive this European cultural conspiracy is. And it's even existent in benign areas. For example, the instantiation of English as the international lingua franca, whereas it's promoted and taught as a requirement in many non-English speaking countries under the guise that it's the language of business, that it's the language of science, that it's the language of media, mass media, and Hollywood, and of music. Okay, so then once you have people buying this, what I call bait, namely that they must learn English in order to have a career, what you do is actually inculcate all of the cultural perversions, all of the cultural prejudices, all of the cultural worldviews of Europeans in the minds of non-Europeans, while they think they're just getting another skill so they can enhance themselves or participate in something that's supposedly ecumenical, such as globalization and internationalization of culture. And within this context, further, we must be very specific and precise about what constitutes a good white person. So that was a lot to say, because I really want to get specific here, because I think this concept is really hindering people from understanding actually what is occurring in the world, how it is detrimental to non-white people, especially African people, because when I use the language example again, we can see phraseology and terminology and semantic usage and syntax and lots of features of the English language specifically, but more broadly the European languages, which are decidedly anti-African. They have the negative context or negative connotations to the word with regard to African people and other non-white people. But for the purposes of this talk, I'm just really focused on African people and the situation concerning white supremacy regarding Africans. So with that said, how can we actually determine whether someone is a good white person? Well, we have one choice. We can decide to wave the white flag. I no pun intended, and accept that the European culture is exactly dominating and will be pervasive and will eventually entrance all of the citizens of the world, of each independent nation, and participate in the activity that emanated from Europe, which is essentially a perversion of several cultures and their own psychoses that developed in Europe. Or we can actually dig further and decide, among African people primarily, but other colonized people, what actually is a good white person in the midst of this global financial domination, cultural domination, inability to access one's cultural heritage, language, cultural rituals, of festivals, and own expressions, like expressions through, architecture, expressions through literature, without fear of being colonized and perverted through the institutions of financial power, like the music industry did with hip hop. So I've developed a list which discusses some essential criteria for determining whether a European is indeed this conceptualized, quote, good white person, end quote. I have 8 on my list, but I added one recently, which is not my own idea. It's from Dr. Frances Cress Welsing and her book, The ISIS Papers. And she states in that book that, if white people actually, seek to be beneficial to African people or black people, and I'm paraphrasing Dr. Cress Welsing's work, if white people seek to be beneficial to African people, then they should inform African people what Europeans or white people say when there are no other non-white people around, particularly African people. That would be very helpful for us to get a truer view and a view more consistent with reality as to who these people are. Because before I get into the criteria, and that's one in the list of 8, I actually have 8 plus 1 because I didn't come up with Dr. Frances Cress Welsing's criterion, so that's the 1. I'll get into the 8 very soon, but we don't actually determine or set out to examine who these Europeans are. And that is a tragic mistake. In fact, it breaks one of Sun Tzu Bing Fa's cardinal rule. If you don't know Sun Tzu Bing Fa, we call him Sun Tzu in Western vernacular. And remember, I did say that most of these languages are European, which actually pervert and bastardize concepts and phonetic utterances and semantics. So we call him Sun Tzu, but Chinese people refer to him as Sun Tzu Bing Fa. So the failure to actually examine who this European is by African people is a grave mistake, and we have been severely hampered by an inability to do this. So for a alleged good white person to inform African people of what white people discuss when there are no African people present would be one criterion to assist us in determining whether or not this is a good white person. But returning to our failure to study the European, in the chapter Attack by Stratagem in Sun Tzu Bing Fa's book, The Art of War, point 18, he says the following, quote, Hence the saying, if you know the enemy and know yourself, you need not fear the result of 100 battles. If you know yourself, but not the enemy, for every victory gained you will suffer a defeat. If you know neither the enemy nor yourself, you will succumb in every battle. End quote. So our failure to investigate and study and really research who the European is, what European culture is, what is European psychology, has been detrimental to us African people for, if not centuries, definitely several decades, but I'd argue centuries, if not millennia. But anyway, let me get into my working list of criteria for determining a good white person. And there are 8 points, and I start with this preamble. The said European or white person purportedly being, quote, good, end quote, must meet these criteria to be considered a good white person by Africans or melanites or black and or other colonized victims of European domination, colonization, imperialism, systemic racism, and the ideology of white supremacy. Number 1, the European cannot, must not have sex or intimate romantic relationships with non-European people. Now, why do I say this? Well, because of the history. Simply stated that the history of rape, sex slavery, with regard to Africans in America, there were sex farms, with regard to the offspring of hybrid people and the selling of hybrid people, and actually in the United States, post-slavery, post the quote, Emancipation Proclamation, end quote, lots of these hybrid people, commonly known as mulattoes, were housed in brothels and restricted only to the availability of white men, European men, for their sexual gratification. So with that history, the Europeans have committed all over the world, and even to this day with their the international pedophilia rings, commonly known as the Catholic Church, or, turning once vibrant, prosperous cultures into really sex tourist traps, and for example, Southeast Asia and such. This, if a person purports to be a good white person, or a person is trying to assess whether this European is indeed the, quote, good white person, then they cannot break this rule. They cannot be in intimate relationships, sexual relationships, romantic relationships with non-European people. Number 2, the contribution of resources, skills, or expertise by this European is only accepted by the African or formerly colonized or presently colonized person to fulfill the aims and the stated objectives and goals of the Indigenous African or melanite leadership. This leadership, which has been sanctioned and approved by the collective of African people. So that basically says if, for example, let's take the example of the Mau Mau from Kenya, which are presently pursuing a legal resolution to the atrocities committed by the European British people on Mau Mau rebels trying to, liberate their country from the invading criminals from Britain. And they have a lead lawyer who is in fact a European. Well, if that were the case, supposedly they couldn't find an African lawyer who was qualified to file the case and argue the case. Let's say that is actually the situation, and so they, hire or secure the resources and skills of a European person. That European person must work on behalf of the leadership of that group or that entity, and under the direction of that entity, an entity being sanctioned and approved by the collective in said African entity. This is because we want to prevent the good white person, quote unquote, who has a savior complex and has the superiority complex, and from coming in and trying to control, direct, orchestrate a situation which benefits Europeans subtly, and we want to prevent that person from being a witting or unwitting agent of the European cultural conspiracy. Okay, because even some of these, Peace Corps people or these NGO people who are Europeans who go trotting off to some country that's been ravaged by Europe for, decades, if not centuries, are working in conjunction with this conspiracy, because they are purporting that there are some nice people and there are some evil people, and that these nice people are coming to save you from their evil cousins and brothers, and so it confuses the people. So we can't have that. So if anyone is going to work with African people and they truly want to alleviate the conditions that have been imposed upon African people, and they're European and they're under evaluation to determine whether they are indeed this, quote, good white person, end quote, then they can only contribute resources, skills, and expertise under the leadership, and the leadership has to be approved by the collective of African people. Number 3, I reiterate, a good white person, if not contributing resources, skills, and expertise, must serve under the leadership and direction of African people. Okay, so no saviors, I went to Harvard, so I know more. None of these people have. I have 10 years of experience in, Merrill Lynch and and the Treasury Department, and I know more than you. So I'm going to run this organization, and I'm going to tell you how it's done. No, even if you have those kind of credentials, you must serve under the leadership of African people. African people have to be self-determining. African people have to understand their psychology, their worldview, and they will inform you what they need from you, and you must perform that task if you're indeed a, quote, good white person, end quote. Number 4, a good white person maintains direct contact only with a trained diplomatic corps. Okay, so this is very important, because this means that one of these white people or Europeans can't just walk in to a nation, walk in to a neighborhood, walk into a community, and just be welcomed to open arms, welcomed, unquestioningly, by everyone, because, oh, this must be one of the good white people that, really like us, and they can come in here, they can come over here for dinner, they can go to our church, they can go to, anywhere they want, and they can buy houses, buy this, buy that, and we don't question their motivation or intentions at all. Okay, so in order to prevent people from filtering in and slowly gentrifying an area or slowly eroding the cultural character matrix of a particular community, nation, or community, we must ensure that any good white person first must deal, or primarily must deal, or in perpetuity must deal with a trained diplomatic corps of people specifically, developed to interact with these good white people. They can't just go anywhere they want. And this diplomatic corps then reports directly to the leadership and prepares and publishes reports for the general masses. Now, this is important because not only does it help to prevent some infiltrator from damaging the delicate cultural matrix that African people have built over, centuries or decades or what have you, it allows the African people to take some responsibility by training people to, and to carry out their interests, and it gives them a conceptual framework to understand themselves as a nation, as an identifiable group with interest and goals and a social cohesion that is at the base of their existence, and an important entity to cherish and defend. So this has, more than one beneficial aspect to it, and it empowers the public by actually producing literature and information for them to peruse and study for their own benefit and awareness. Moving on, number 5. Any European person that speaks of integration, multiculturalism, Marxism, socialism, communism, or promotes a neo-hippie, quote, all people are one man, end quote, ideology, or promotes an ideology which insists that, quote, all people are the same, end quote. And these ideologies imply that people have the same needs and wants on a cultural, spiritual, political, and economic level, especially if it's done in the context of known and provable history, as well as in the presence of this media propaganda, brainwashing, and promotion of harmful images to promote white superiority. Any person who entertains any of the aforementioned concepts and precepts is not allowed to participate in an organization that directly serves the needs and desires of African people, and is hence not a good white person. Now this is a deal breaker for about, I say, 70-80% of these people who supposedly have attained the status of being a good white person, with reference to African people. Now let's break this down. Number 5. Let's break it down, because I want to go into why I put integration in there. Integration does not work in a cultural or social relationship in which you have one group that is the dominator and one group that is subjugated. What happens is that the subjugated ends up entering and the dominating entity's culture, and ends up eventually disintegrating through the process of genocide. Because the institutions, the cultural mores, the power brokers and power centers are already established in the dominating culture. Therefore, the people continue to be subjected. They're just not physically and by decree prevented from moving within the society at large. So anyone who says that integration is good for the subjugated group is either naive or is trying to purposely destroy cultural cohesion of the group that has been under domination by a foreign entity for however many long years. Multiculturalism is the same. Multiculturalism is really just a refined white supremacy, because what multiculturalism essentially argues is that, okay, there's no more apartheid, there's no more discrimination, everyone is the same, but you must participate in European culture. Yeah, European values are preeminent on a daily basis. Yes, we may have Cinco de Mayo or a community Kwanzaa celebration. We may have at the workplace, everyone brings their, cultural or ethnic dish, and, maybe we'll all go to the Jamaican restaurant this weekend, or that is really benign and unnecessary, So multiculturalism doesn't do anything to change the power relationships, power dynamics, and the concept of normality, which is pervasive throughout the society as a whole, especially these European offshoot nations like Canada and the United States and Australia, etc. It does nothing to change all of that. So multiculturalism, if it's argued by a European, that's a deal breaker. They are not a good white person. Marxist socialism, and communism, I get into this because essentially these are European constructs, political constructs, and it's not to say that there aren't some useful elements in the arguments of Marx and Engels. It's just to say that if African people, when we are involved in our own self-determining nation-state project, if we decide to choose elements from Marxism, socialism, and communism, and some outside entity decides to pin that label on it, well, so be it. You know, lots of people use the Russian example to say that, you know, socialism or communism is a failure. Well, you know, that's their business. But in order to create a society which works for African values, if we actually use some elements from these political ideologies, that doesn't mean we're actually adopting socialism. It means we're doing something which works for us. But to actually force us to take the ideologies in whole cloth straight from these German philosophers and German political theoreticians, I don't think that is an actual good idea, especially given the history of how it has been used to actually destroy African liberation movements and force Africans into a fake solidarity on the basis of being workers with Europeans whose working class was essentially created on the backs of African people, and have at every turn, when they were given the choice to, sold out and betrayed African people. So, you know, anyone who preaches Marxism, socialism, or communism is not a good white person, and they must be discounted based on these criteria. Any white person who promotes the neo-hippie ideology, you know, that all people are one, and ideology which insists that all people are the same, you know, they are lacking an essential understanding that just because everyone has to eat, everyone has to breathe, that doesn't mean we're all the same. We all have different needs based on a collective regarding spiritual, cultural, political, and economics. Okay, we want to organize our society around our own festivals. We want to organize our politics around our economic activity, which is based on different concepts and principles than capitalism or even socialism and communism, as it was proffered by Marx and Engels. Spiritual and cultural. I mean, African people are very creative. We have it as it is bastardized and kind of, you know, plasticized, if that's the word, you know, in the media. You know, our spirituality is much deeper than going to a church and hooping and hollering, and really that hooping and hollering is indicative of the psychosis that colonized people, especially African people, have undergone by being subjected to European domination. Okay, but it really is the only way, the only manner in which African people have been allowed to express their spirituality, because it's the only manner in which it supports the superiority complex of Europeans. You know, if we had our own, you know, spiritual systems, then it actually excises the European from involvement, and they could not actually benefit or participate at all. So these are the fundamental differences that we must recognize. And so anyone who purports these notions of, you know, neo-hippieism or multiculturalism, you know, is not a good white person with regard to benefiting us as cohesive people who are African identified. Furthermore, within the context of the media propaganda and brainwashing, you know, we can't all be an integrated multicultural, you know, society and social relations with this onslaught of media propaganda that is constantly harping day in, day out through all of the institutions, educational, journalistic, you know, even workplace institutions, about, you know, these base images that promote a certain style, a certain look, you know, which is decidedly anti-African. And as I said before, these concepts are steeped within European languages, especially the English language. So any white person that promotes any of these ideologies and concepts, schools of thought, cannot be considered a good white person. Number 6, any, quote, good white person, if they are to be deemed as such, must have a working knowledge of African history, both ancient and contemporary, as well as have accepted the brutality and crimes of the Europeans as an unquestionable fact without argument. Now, this is a deal breaker here for many supposedly good white people. I've had many conversations with these, quote, liberal white people, and it's interesting. The minute you start talking about slavery or colonization, the first thing they bring up as a knee-jerk reaction is, oh, well, Africans sold Africans too. As if that eliminates the culpability and responsibility of Europeans on a tricontinental level. The minuscule numbers of Africans that participated in whatever rounding of slaves on the continent pales in comparison to building the largest financial empire known in the modern era, namely the United States and its European cousins and offshoots. Okay, there were no Africans systematically raping and producing mulattoes and selling them for money, or relegating them to a lifelong existence in a brothel for the pleasure of European men. There are no Africans trading in bonds and developing insurance companies, many of which are still in existence today, in order to make a profit off the trade of kidnapping Africans from Africans and selling them in the United States, in South America, Brazil, and the Caribbean. There were no Africans building the ships, selling the ships, sailing the ships. There were no Africans selling other Africans on the stocks and the blocks in the Western Hemisphere. I mean, so we can go on and on and on with this. So that whole canard of Africans sold Africans as supposedly being a valid rebuttal to the criminality of the entire transatlantic slave trade enterprise is ridiculous. Therefore, that's why I put in that the brutality of Europeans and the crimes they committed must be accepted as an unquestionable fact without argument. I mean, the evidence is clear, the facts are clear. Anything to refute that, or that is said to refute that now, is really just someone trying to play an emotional game and not wanting to accept the reality of the situation. And any, quote, good white person must have working knowledge of African history and ancient, and contemporary as well. They can't just say, well, yeah, I really like Jay-Z, and, that doesn't work. You have to go deeper than that. If you just like Jay-Z, that's fine. Well, okay, maybe I can, have a sandwich with you at lunch, or, say hi as we cross each other in the hall, but that's it. That's the depth of the relationship. We must start using these criteria to determine who is really on our side and who's just, a sleepwalking, beneficiary of the persistence of white supremacy. Number 7, any, quote, good white person must be part of an organization or is presently engaged in activity which seeks to directly or indirectly aid the liberation of African people and melanites globally. Now, you might say, oh, well, some African people aren't in organizations, so why should Europeans do? This privileges us. This gives us an advantage, okay? We are the ones who are under cultural psychosis, okay? So many people don't understand these concepts in the history who are African people because of the indoctrinational system called the educational system. But if someone is literally, attempting to pass themselves off as a, quote, good white person, this is essential. You can't just let me borrow sugar next door or even move in next door, and because you're willing to live around African people and say, okay, well, I'm a good white person because I don't mind living in an all African or all black neighborhood. No, you must participate in an organization and keeping in with the previous criteria, serving under the leadership of African people, contribution of resources and skills accepted to fulfill the stated aims of African people, those must all be fulfilled as well. None of these can just be fulfilled in isolation. They all must be fulfilled together. Number 8, last but not least, if the said European or white, nominally white individual has not accepted that African people have decidedly different needs, a different cultural identity, a unique historical truth, and that African people have persisting and deep emotional and psychological trauma with which African people need to deal, which incidentally has been transmitted sociogenetically due to slavery, colonialism, and other crimes at the hands of the ideology of white supremacy and institutional racism, as defined and conceptualized by African people, then that person is not considered a, quote, good white person, end quote. Let me break this down a little bit. Now, I'm essentially trying to further privilege African people with conceptual frameworks that are viewed from our historical existence and our existence in the present framework of globalized and expanding white supremacy. Okay? Any so-called good white person must understand that there are emotional and psychological trauma. So you can't sit here and go pointing out each individual thing that you might see and try to judge that based on European criteria for assessing good and bad. We have our own issues to deal with. We are seeking independent institutions where we can set up psychological centers for therapeutic evaluation and treatment to deal with what has persisted over these several decades and centuries untreated because of the innate cultural conspiracy within European people to realize their inherent notions of being superior to everything else in the natural world. So we must define what institutional racism is and what white supremacy is. That cannot be defined by this so-called good white person. Okay, and they must recognize, in addition to our history, is that there is a negative result from the historical crimes committed by their ancestors. And if they think that because they weren't there, that negates the crimes, that is a deal breaker with regard to being considered a good white person. So this is a working list. These criteria can be amended, and feel free to add to this list in the comments section. I'm willing to listen to all reasonable and constructive additions, but this is kind of the idea I'm putting out there, is that we really at this stage need to really sit down and hash out a workable set of criteria that we can train children into using, because if you don't know, Europeans have one. Yeah, okay. If you don't defer to them, you're not a good African person. If you don't, say hi to them first, you're not a good African person. If you don't, do a little buck dance here and there, if you don't laugh at their little, snide joke about slavery because, hey, it was way back then they think you're not a good white person. So they have criteria too. Okay, but it's infused in their culture and it's promoted through the media system and the indoctrinational system and through just their interaction with other Europeans. We are forced to give up this power in order to survive just by getting a job and going to school. We need to reclaim that power, establish our own criteria, and use that criteria. Okay, and that would assist in the several levels of work that we have to do in order to realize, a cohesive unit of, self-determination and independence and identity in the world going forward. Because what these, parasitic globalists have in mind is basically to reduce everyone to a consumer, put everyone in debt, erase all borders, get everyone all mixed up, produce people who are, 3/4, Chinese, 1/2, eighth, indigenous nation from the Western Hemisphere, quarter, this, they want to do that, so you don't have any allegiance, any solidarity, you just identify with other people based on your consumption habits. That's not going to work. The remedy for this international push, this globalization, is actually not shopping more. It's actually not developing economies. It's actually going back to national identity and cultural identity and history. Okay? Anything else is just going to confuse the situation, and you're going to have an absolute catastrophe on this planet. So we'll see if that happens. But, you know, as I said, feel free to contribute, and I want to thank you for listening.
Nothing at all. Half a love never appealed to me. If your heart never could yield to me,